to our website for those that would like to see it in the future. So again, welcome tonight to our available funding opportunities for outdoor recreation projects presented by the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources here within New Hampshire State Parks. I just want to highlight the three folks that are going to take part in this panel. First, again, I want to introduce myself. For those that don't know me, my name is Eric Feldbaum. I'm the Community Recreation Specialist for the Division of Parks and Recreation. I not only manage the Office of Community Recreation, which happens to house our LWCF program, but I'm also the alternate state liaison officer for the LWCF program and have been designated by our governor as the liaison between the state and the National Park Service. Next, we have Bill Gagas, who is our LWCF program specialist, also with the Division of Parks and Recreation, Office of Community Rec. He is our technical guy when it comes to managing grants for this program. And most likely, if you go to submit an application in the future or have an open grant, he is the person that manages the grants as well as in charge of future stewardship and compliance of all program rules. And last but not least, Alexis Redko, who is our recreational trails program specialist for our Division of Parks and Recreation through our Trails Bureau. And she oversees the entire recreational trails program from granting to project closeout. So I guess we'll dive right in and get started. I just want to share a brief little overview of what tonight's schedule will look like. As I said, we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between both the LWCF and RTP project to kind of paint a little picture of how each of them work. There's some similarities between the two, but there are also many differences. So we're going to touch on a brief history of both programs. We're going to talk about what projects are eligible under each grant round. We're going to talk about how to apply. We're going to talk about different match, which I know is a big concern of a lot of folks out there when looking to federal grants, is what can they match their projects with. And then we're going to end, like I said, with some questions. So with that said, we'll dive right into it. First off is the LWCF and RTP history. With regards to LWCF, it was established in 1965, making it about a 55-year plus program. Some recent news, if you haven't followed, it was permanently reauthorized back in 2018 under the John D. Dingell Act. And then most recently, this past summer, it was permanently and fully funded through the Great American Outdoors Act, which is some major news for probably one of the largest conservation programs in the country. It was developed really as a prime during the late 60s, during prime development, as a way to build a national suite of outdoor recreation opportunities for the general public. And it continues to expand on that. One of the greatest things about this fund is not taxpayer dollars. It's actually a really interesting funding source. It comes from offshore gas and oil revenue out in the continental shelf. Our agency, the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, is designated by the governor as the funding agency for this program, as well as we are designated as the state liaison office as reported between the National Park Service and the state. Our commissioner, Sarah Stewart, is our state liaison officer, and myself and Director Bryce are both alternate state liaison officers for this program. As we'll get more into it around match requirements, the LWCF program is a 50-50 match requirement with a requirement that 100% of all costs incurred up front and then being reimbursed. So it is a reimbursement program. One of the big keys to this program, as some of you might know who have already received funding, for those that have not received funding, the big catch to our program is that properties that receive funding must permanently be protected. And what that means is under the LWCF Act of 1965, is any LWCF property or any property acquired or developed with LWCF assistance should not be converted to anything other than outdoor recreation unless approved by the Secretary of the Interior. So the real key here is perpetuity when we begin to talk about sites that have been developed. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on tonight. As I said, this is a partnership program managed by the Department of the Interior through the National Park Service. It is designated here at the state level through the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And then you'll notice your sponsor logo here. You are part of that combined partnership within a circle. We have the ability to sub out our grants, and we'll talk to that as well a little bit more later on this evening. But it truly is a partnership program that goes beyond just the state level. So as I talked about it, the Land and Water Conservation Program is a national program. It's impacted almost every single county in this nation. Here in New Hampshire, funds have helped develop and acquire outdoor recreation in many of our state parks, our state forests, as well as many of our local community parks statewide. Nationally, there's a little over 42,000 projects. Here in New Hampshire, there's a little over 670 projects. Anything from as basic as a playground to large land acquisition. Really key here is this is the only federal grant program that goes for acquisition and development of public recreation. And it's important to know that you'll see about an 8% investment or $8+ billion investment in outdoor recreation. So elements of our land and water conservation program, and I'll touch on a couple real quick. First off is to understand the elements that are required within our program. The first is our SCORP. For a state to be eligible to receive LWCF funds, they must have an approved SCORP. That SCORP stands for the State Comprehensive Outdoor Rec Plan, as outlined within the federal program. Approved by National Park Service, our SCORP is a 5-year planning document used to evaluate the supply and demand of outdoor recreation facilities in our state. The SCORP is used to outline priorities and goals that have met by funding. So I would start off with this: is if you don't think your project meets our SCORP, most likely it's not going to be funded. Our current SCORP, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's based on our website, nhstateparks.org. We also have hard copies of them for anyone that might be interested. But our current SCORP is from 2019 to 2023. And the big key of our SCORP is it outlines 4 priorities. And those priorities are as easy as connecting people to the outdoors, consistent conservation and stewardship, economic vitality, education ethics, and benefits. So again, very broad topics, and the hope and the goal is that if your project is being proposed for LWCF funding, that it meets one or if not all 4 of those priorities as outlined in our SCORP. Once a project meets those guidelines, just a touch briefly on how projects are scored and selected through our open project selection process, which consists of some guidelines as well as an advisory panel. Those members are made up of general public, state agencies, as well as park and rec professionals. They take those applications and our guidance, they score and rank them. And once those projects are scored and ranked, they then move forward through review via our state liaison officer. And then once projects are signed off by our state liaison officer, they then move to the National Park Service to be funded. I just want to answer a quick little question about our SCORP. Someone asked, will the SCORP document be modified based on the pandemic in 2020? As of right now, it will not be. There's no plans to have it updated. Our next SCORP will probably actually begin sometime this spring. It takes about 1.5 years or so and ready for 2023. So as you're going to learn tonight, there's different eligibility requirements for both these programs that we'll talk about. But for first, I just want to touch on LWCF, being that the application sponsor must be able to submit there must be a subunit of government that fits into any one of these categories. So this is probably one of the largest differences between LWCF and RTP that Alexis is going to touch on with RTP, sorry. But with an LWCF, you must be a subunit of government eligible for funding. So you must be either a town, a city, a village district, and there's some caveats to village districts where the town must be a co-sponsor, knowing that a village district at any point can be dissolved. School districts are eligible, county government, state government, and then state colleges and universities. These are the only entities that can sponsor a project. So I just want to be very clear there. I know somebody asked a question earlier, can NGOs submit applications? This isn't to say that a private citizen, a community group, or an NGO can't work with a subunit of government as listed above. But the grant, the property ownership must be held by a subunit of government. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about application and match requirements. So for those that are thinking about applying, be aware that a property must, as I was saying, a property must be legally controlled or owned by the sponsor prior to as a result of this project. So what I mean by that is ownership can come in the form of fee title, a less than fee title, which usually could consist of an access or a control easement, or a lease. And it's important to know that if a lease is sought for legal control, it can only be leased from another public or government entity. So you cannot lease land from a private landowner. Once the project is completed, the protected property must be open and accessible to all. And as we're going to continue to talk about, the LWCF program is based on providing recreational opportunities for the general public. LWCF is an outdoor recreation program. So again, funding is designed to provide the public resource and availability to outdoor recreation. That's really the big key here. There are certain indoor, so we talked a little bit about outdoor recreation, again, being the focus. There are certain allowances for indoor facilities that are allowed under this funding source. But it's important to remember that that indoor structure or indoor resource must be secondary to the outdoor recreational resource. So if the indoor structure is a support facility to the primary recreation, then it is allowed. If the indoor use is primary to the property, then it is not allowed. So an example of an indoor structure could be things like bathroom house, a bathhouse, a maintenance facility that supports that specific property, ski lodges, which we'll talk a little bit more on, but really truly support facilities to the outdoor recreation that is taking place. And then the last is coverage of swimming pools or ski rink or ice skating rinks specific to cold climate regions. So here in New Hampshire, I think we have a couple swimming pools that have been enclosed, but that's really the only type of enclosed recreation that may be allowed. All right. So I'm gonna, before I throw it over to Alexis, I'm gonna answer one question. Someone asks, how long does the lease have to be in place? A lease with a public entity can be no more or no less than a minimum of 25 years. But it needs to be understood that the project sponsor that is leasing the property ultimately is held to perpetuity of the recreational resource. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So with that, I hand it over to Alexis.
Thank you, Eric. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for starting us off, Eric. So for the Recreational Trails Program, it was established in 1991 within the Federal Highway Trust Fund. This fund is fueled by off-highway recreational vehicles gas taxes. There was an algorithm created. The last one was updated in 2009. So some of these OHRVs include not just snowmobiles and ATVs, but also light duty trucks. And other types of recreational vehicles. So if you basically own an SUV or any sort of small truck, you technically are paying into this fund every time you buy gas. So it is public money, and it's subject to Title 23 of the U.S. Code, Chapter 2, Section 206. So this is administered nationally by the Federal Highway Administration. So we take all of our instructions from them. It goes directly to the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. They are the actual grant recipients, and then they pass the money through locally to the New Hampshire Bureau of Trails. It's a highly competitive grant process. I get lots of grant requests every year, and I'd love to fund everybody, but sometimes we have to pick some projects over others based on the needs of the state. So the RTP funds were funded from 2015 to 2020 with the FAST Act. Those funds actually ran out in 2020, and we are under continuing resolution until September of 2021. We are hoping that they will pass the next federal funding bill through federal highway. It's currently on Congress right now, but as with everything, COVID delayed it. So we'll see what happens this year. Next slide, please. This graphic is from 2017. It was created to kind of show the flow of funds between the Highway Trust Fund and to local communities through the Recreational Trails Fund. There's been numerous projects just in New Hampshire as well as throughout the entire country. So this project benefits all sorts of users, not just users that are paying into the Highway Trust Fund with gas taxes. It also has the side effect of basically providing trails and recreation opportunities for other users, including non-motorized users, as well as motorized. Next slide, please. So who can apply for RTP funds? And this is where the big kind of difference is between LWCF and RTP. While municipalities and government organizations are welcome to apply for RTP, this is also open to nonprofits and private organizations. These have to be registered with the Secretary of State, which is a very easy process, but it's just one little caveat to applying for RTP. One thing I tell everybody is if you are going to apply for RTP, we publicly post all of these organization names as well as what the project is on our website. It is also part of the RTP database, which is what helps fuel in Congress continued support for the RTP program. All of those can also be found on the Coalition for Recreational Trails website, which is a link in the RTP website. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'll turn it back over to you, Eric, because now it is going to be types of eligible projects.
So I jumped the gun and actually wanted to kind of engage the folks that are on the webinar today. And so I just want to kind of throw up a quick little poll, actually two polls. And the first is if you guys wouldn't mind responding. And the first is, which programs are you interested in learning about today? We just wanted to try to gauge what people are thinking about. I'll give it a second or so for folks to respond. All right. I appreciate that. And I'm going to put out one more poll. And this is more so just trying to gauge if folks on this call are new to these two programs, whether you've used LWCF RTP before in the past. All right. Appreciate you guys responding on that. So we're going to move forth with types of eligible projects. And like I said, we're going to start off with LWCF and then move on to RTP. I also want to say that we kind of took the big hitters of the projects we mostly see. There are a couple projects that may be allowed under the LWCF program that might not necessarily be listed here. But I'll start with this. If it has anything to do with outdoor recreation, most likely it's allowable by the LWCF program rules. But I'll start with this. The first one is acquisition of land. I'm going to dive a little bit more into each types of projects, so I won't go too much into what kind of acquisitions we provide, but you can provide funding for acquisition of land. We do provide funding for trail development, but it's important to understand that we do not provide funding for trail maintenance or any type of maintenance project. Unlike RTP, you'll notice that does allow for maintenance of trails. Playgrounds, which is kind of when people think parks, is usually the one thing that people go to. We've seen a large surge in playgrounds lately, as many of the playgrounds that are out there have met their useful lifespan, as well as we're seeing trends in playgrounds changing quite drastically in the past couple of years. The next one is sports facilities. And this is anything from baseball to soccer, to football fields, any types of sport facilities, as long as they are not semi or professional sports arenas. The next is boating facilities. Both of our funding sources do fund boating facilities, but it's important to know that there is a caveat within the LWCF program that if it is providing funding for boat access, it must first be funded through the Dingell-Johnson funds, which are administered through Fish and Game. So if you're thinking about funding a boating facility with LWCF, we want to start that conversation now with Fish and Game to verify that there actually are not funds available under that program first before you move on for LWCF funding. The next is educational projects. Unlike LWCF, RTP projects are eligible for funding. The next one is planning projects. The only reason there's a green dot under LWCF, and I just wanted to highlight this, is we use the state as eligible for funding to actually help write and develop our SCORP. So we provide a 50-50 match when our agency develops our SCORP document, which is that state comprehensive outdoor rec plan. And then the last category that we've broken out is equipment, otherwise known as trail maintenance. RTP is the only eligible entity for allowance of funding for that. And Alexis, I don't know if you want to add in any other comments that I've put there.
Sure. Definitely trail maintenance for RTP. That is probably the number one thing that we fund for existing trails. One thing that is not offered by LWCF, which is kind of unique to RTP, is educational projects. So if you have those are for smaller amounts than the maintenance, but if you have an education project in mind, certainly RTP could put that in for consideration. So turn it back over to you. Oh, and real quick, the equipment, the trail maintenance, that's another big one. We actually have an ability to buy trail maintenance equipment, but it's very limited, and I'll get to that. Because of the Buy America law, we have to follow that in order to purchase anything. And I'll talk more about that later. But back to you, Eric.
All right. So as we get into a little bit of the detail on eligibility of projects, we'll start off with LWCF for a second. So we talked about kind of the details on the previous slide, but I kind of now want to dive into kind of two areas when we start talking about eligibility of the scope of project. And there's two within LWCF. One is development, one is acquisition. So to touch base on development for a second, development, any type of development project that is being funded by LWCF should either include development for new or renovation of any outdoor recreation facility. Again, development should enhance or improve accessibility, which we're starting to see a big increase on. It's actually called out in our SCORP, as well as a lot of communities are finding that their old parks are just not developed in a way that really maximize the use by community members. Again, remember that maintenance projects under LWCF are not eligible. So it's important to remember when developing your project and budget that you also can include planning costs. And those planning costs can be up to 3 years prior to the submission period. And those planning costs could be anything from site plans, preliminary design, environmental review and permitting, construction drawings are all eligible for reimbursement. So if you're starting to develop your project today, but you don't think you're going to apply for another year or so, make sure you're tracking those costs so that when you develop your project application and budget, those are part of it. As those costs can be used either towards reimbursement or as match towards your project approval. So that takes care of development. The second part of it is acquisition. And acquisition falls into kind of three categories as we like to think. The first is land that is purchased to add to an already existing developed recreation, or I should say public recreational property. So if this takes your boundary of your park, this will encompass both the acquired property and the previously developed property. We'll talk a little bit about what a 6F boundary is in a moment. The second is if you're purchasing a already developed recreation from a private entity. So this could be anything from a private ballpark, a private park, a private school that might have a park developed on it. This also could be a private recreation developed area that might be adjacent to a public recreation area. This is just straight acquisition of already developed recreation. And the third is acquisition of previously undeveloped land. And I just want to make sure that there is a caveat to this option. And that is that there must be at a minimum, minimal public access development as part of your proposal. So you cannot just straight out buy 100 acres of land and say it's accessible and it's open. And so that minimum public development of your part of your project must at least address kind of two areas. And the first is public access, which we think parking lots or car access. And the second is some sort of trail access so that public can actually get to and take advantage of the interior of your property. This type of project that we talk about as acquisition and development, we tend to consider it part of what we call a combination project, where there will typically be an acquisition and then a development stage to the project. So as I said on the previous slide, that third type is a combination. Most acquisitions of land we see come forward fall into this category and shows that there is some sort of minimal development that usually tends to include a parking lot, or if there's already a parking lot there, a trail development or a trail plan. And it's good to remember that the focus of LWCF funding is to provide the public an opportunity to recreate in an easily accessible way. So the more that your project provides an opportunity, the higher probability your project will mostly be chosen, highly ranked, and funded. So those are kind of the two parts. And then I'm going to hand it over to Alexis, and we're going to talk a little bit about RTP eligibility.
Thank you. So there's basically 5 projects that we tend to fund on a regular basis. The most that we fund will be maintenance and restoration of existing trails. It's where 90% of the funding goes towards. And then it's kind of a mix between the other ones. Development and rehabilitation of trailside facilities is also popular. This is where you have like kiosks or parking lots or something that would be allowing you to access the trail. Category C is purchasing of trail maintenance equipment, which I will get to in a moment. That's where the Buy America provisions apply. Category D, the construction of new trails. This doesn't happen as often, only because there's a lot of restrictions with developing a completely new trail, with cutting a new trail, digging into the ground, obtaining easements depending on where you are. And then there's restrictions on federal property as far as creating new trails. And then category for educational projects, which we've done in the past. Haven't had one in a couple of years, but it'd be interesting to see some new education projects come through. Next slide, please. So the ineligible projects, one of which is project planning. If there is no construction involved, we do not allow this. You can have project planning as part of your construction project, but we try to keep that as minimal as possible, only because your engineering fees could become quite pricey, and we're trying to put as much money into shovel-ready projects on the ground. One thing about RTP is we have a very strict timeline. It is very fast from when the projects are open to when you have construction time and then you have to close the project. So we're really looking for projects that have had a lot of planning already done. So part of what helps in your application is if your project is ready to go. And RTP projects, you apply a year in advance for the funding. So you still have to do a lot of planning before you even start. Feasibility studies administration, it's mostly we're trying to put as much money into the ground, into actual construction projects. So that's why those are not really allowed. There's funds for sidewalks, so we stay away from those. Small tools are hard to track as far as using them specifically for trail construction only. So we do not fund small tools. Anything that's in progress or anything completed prior to the grant, obviously, we want projects that are ready to go. For-profit trail systems, these have to be publicly available trails. So that doesn't mean that a entrance fee to, for example, for a state park, the entrance fee to get into the park is for the facilities of the park as a whole. It doesn't mean you have to pay to access a specific trail within the park, okay? And then same thing with the sidewalks, we do not pave trails. It costs a lot of money and that usually will run up your project costs very quickly. Next slide, please. Oh, there you go. So here is where I was talking about with the Buy America. So the Federal Highway Administration is subject to this law, and it's different than the Buy American law because the Buy America law requires that all steel or iron that is permanently incorporated into a federally assisted project like the RTP program, you have to document that the steel was manufactured, produced, fabricated, assembled, all within the United States. In order to do that, you have to supply mill certificates. And there's an example on the next slide. Recycled steel and iron is okay. Oh, nope, go back, sorry. Yep. So recycled steel is okay, but that also requires quite a bit of documentation. It has been done. And one of my pictures, for examples, is a recycled bridge that shows it was documented where that bridge came from. So even though we didn't have the mill certificates for that bridge, we had the history of the bridge that showed where the bridge came from, which allowed us to use the bridge as recycled steel. And this big thing is if you are getting donated anything that's steel or iron donated as match or coming from another grant that is matching the RTP also has to be documented with Buy America. For equipment, it becomes very difficult. There's only 2 or 3 pieces of trail maintenance equipment that is currently allowed through the Buy America caveat through Federal Highway Administration. And for a big complicated machine, we only are allowed to buy tuckers for the groomers and Arrowhead, the trail groomer, the drag behind the groomer, sorry, the drag, those are also Buy America compliant. There's a couple more, but those are the 2 big ones that we tend to buy the most of. Really, this Buy America comes into play when you're buying steel I-beams for, say, a bridge or steel gates or anything like that, something that's not a complicated machine. It can be done, and a lot of the manufacturers that we tend to regularly purchase the steel from in New Hampshire is aware of this. They will be able to provide these certificates for you. So if something comes up where your vendor doesn't know what you're talking about when they're saying, hey, we need the steel certificates, we need all this compliance documentation, then I suggest you do not buy from them if you are using RTP funds. So we also have the decal with the little picture that's over in the corner of the slide that will be put on the equipment to show that it was purchased with RTP funds. And that piece of equipment is technically owned by the United States government. So it is not to be sold unless the Federal Highway Administration grants permission. So as of now, all of the waivers that we used to be able to apply for back in 2016 and earlier, those are all on hold indefinitely. And according to the Federal Highway Administration, they are not going to change this waiver. So all of the products we used to be able to buy with a waiver, like say an Arctic snowmobile for maintenance, We can't buy those anymore, even though the company will state that they are American made. That doesn't equal Buy America compliance. Okay, next slide, please.
Alexis, before we move on, we've got one question.
Okay.
The question was, what about steel hardware for mounts, sign brackets, etc.? Can we exclude this from the budget if non-compliant?
So this is a good question, and it's something that I go into a little bit more at the RTP workshops if you are applying. The Buy America law basically allows for $2,500 worth of non-compliant steel or iron in a project. So say if you were buying hardware like nuts and bolts and stuff, if the total cost of the steel for the whole project is lower than $2,500, they do not have to be compliant, okay? However, it is cumulative. So if you buy an I-beam or a couple I-beams that are a couple $1,000s a piece and the hardware on top of it, now you're becoming within the threshold. As of right now, for any of the small hardware, DOT and Fed Highway have not been interested in pursuing compliance documentation for those small pieces of hardware, but they are looking at anything bigger than, like, say, a gate or an I-beam or any large piece of steel. That's what they're looking at. So you're usually okay with any of the nuts and bolts. So this is an example mill tester certificate. So right on here, I'm going to use my little cursor, but I don't know. Oh, you won't see it. That's okay. So up, there's three things that I tend to look for this. The date of the certificate, which on this one up in the top right corner, you'll see ship date. Yep, right there. Is from August of 2017. So this is an older certificate I had. If the product that you are buying is fairly new, I'm going to be looking for a fairly new certificate, and it varies from product to product. Over on the far left-hand side, you'll see what's called the heat ID. Now, I'm not sure what this number actually means, but that is, I was told this is required as part of your certificate. So this is what I look for. And then that highlighted green that says 100% melted and manufactured in the USA, that is what we're really looking for right there. So that statement somewhere on some of your test certificates, they have to be part of that package. Now, this is just one test certificate. Some products have pages and pages of test certificates, depending on what it is that you are buying, okay? So it could be 10 pages, could be 30 pages. It just depends on the product. And the manufacturer should be able to supply this. Okay. So another thing about the procurement requirements, one thing that I said earlier, if you buy a piece of equipment like a Tucker groomer, which is a $200,000 plus piece of equipment, the federal government owns that for the life of the equipment. Depending if you get a used piece of equipment or a new, some of these products can be used for 20 years. And so if a club or an organization buys this equipment, you have to be prepared to keep it. And this is just with RTP. If you buy a piece of equipment using our the other grant within our office called the Grant and Aid Program, there are liens from that grant that is applied to equipment. So you would have two liens. So just keep that in mind. If you wish to buy equipment, your organization is going to need to keep it for a very long time, unless the fair market value drops below $5,000, but that's only for RTP. Okay, next slide. Oh, and we're on to Eric. Turn it back over to you.
All right, so we're just going to share a couple sample projects to kind of get some ideas in everyone's heads about what kind of projects we've funded in the past. And hopefully this tries to help show not only what our programs fund under availability, but what kind of projects tend to rank high within both of our grant program scoring criteria. So I'll start off with a couple of LWCF projects. Hopefully for those folks that are out there listening, you might have interacted in a couple of these properties or projects. But I'll start with property right in Weirs Community Park, right in right kind of downtown central to the Weirs Beach. Funding went into building a nature-based playground, or at least it looks like a nature-based playground with some tree structures. So again, playgrounds, as I said before, are typically a highly funded property or project, especially when they increase the accessibility to users. As I talked about accessibility, this is one of them. This is a fully ADA accessible fishing pier at Osgood Pond in Milford. Not only is the pier accessible, or the fishing pier is accessible, but so is the pathway leading to and from that pathway, from that pier. I talked a little bit about indoor structures for a second. I just want to point out this one. This is what we all know here in New England as a ski lodge, not necessarily for lodging purposes of sleeping, but it's an indoor ski lodge at a community ski area in Wolfboro called Abenaki Ski Area. And LWCF funding actually helped construct this building. And this holds bathroom facilities, ski rental, first aid, concessions, open community space for those people to come in and get warm. The great part about this building is not only is it a winter indoor structure for the ski area, but it's a four-season facility for community members that are actively using the Wolfboro Trail system that actually abuts this building as a bathroom and a central support facility for the outdoor recreation. So this is kind of one of our recently prime indoor facilities that we've funded. Another little pocket park right in Seabrook, right along 1A. This is called Harborside Park. This is a paved pathway park with benches, picnic areas. As you'll notice, the picnic areas are ADA accessible. So this is, again, a universally designed facility that meets ADA code. Another indoor structure, this is within a state park, Jericho Mountain State Park, up north, up in Berlin. This is a redevelopment of a brand new bathhouse to assist in not only our campground up at Jericho, but also the beach. This building houses concessions to the right. You'll see in this area is a small concession area. Bathrooms, laundry facilities, and showers are all developed within this building. In Belmont, this is the Belmont Recreation Pavilion, which is along the rail trail. It's kind of the start of a rail trail in Belmont. Here is a pavilion recreational resource. They also happen to have their community farmers market here, community events. There was a development of a parking, the pavilion, and then pathway down. This was a acquisition style project of Thompson Forest, and this is a great example. Someone asked a question earlier before, can an NGO take part in an LWCF project? Thompson Forest was a project spearheaded by a land trust in the area that worked with the town of Durham to acquire a fairly large piece of property along a water body to develop for trails, and funding here went into the development of this parking lot as well as a trail system along the property. And so this resulted in the land trust holding an easement over the property and the town owning it in fee. As we talk about some boating access, this is along the Cocheco River in downtown Dover. This is kind of phase one of hopefully will be many phases of recreation develop along their waterfront in downtown Dover. This was the first phase that is a accessible pier that is used for public. You'll notice fully accessible kayak launch as well as a fairly large dock for crew for the local community. This is hopefully going to spear some private development on an abutting parcel as well as future development of a park along the river that is placed there. So that's kind of a sampling of LWCF projects, and I'll turn it back over to Alexis to share some RTP projects.
Yes, so here is an example of a Tucker Trail groomer that was purchased with RTP funds. This is what I mentioned by a Buy America compliant groomer. So this is used to groom snowmobile trails. Next slide. And this is a drag, which you pull behind the groomer. So also Arrowhead is one of our compliant drags that we are allowed to buy. So I tend to get certificates for Arrowhead and Tucker ahead of time. I get them directly from the company to kind of help out any potential grantees. So it's easier for me to get some of these certificates for these two companies, but anything other than these two companies, I don't have the certificates for. So it'd be up to the sponsor to acquire them. Next, there we go. So these are steps up Mount Avalon and Crawford Notch State Park. We do fund a lot of trail maintenance, and this is one of the most funded types of projects, is general, just trying to get that trail maintained, keep people within the trail tread, keep them off of the sides of the trail to slow down erosion. Hiking is one of the most impactful activities you can do to a trail, just from the sheer number of people and footprints that go through there. It just over time will wear down any trail, so you have to maintain them. Next. So this was in Hooksett. The Hooksett Conservation Commission put this boardwalk in over a wetland area. This was part of their project in 2015, and it leads to some of their other trail systems, and it leads towards the river as you curve around this bend right here. So part of every RTP project is an environmental review, and it is up to the organization to secure all wetlands permits. Hooksett did an excellent job with getting all of their permits in place, which made it very easy for this decision to fund this project. Next. So this is a canoe access point on the Androscoggin River. It's like an example of a water trail. We don't fund a lot of these, but I liked this project because it was one of the first ones that I've ever seen since I have worked with the Trails Bureau. Northern Forest Canoe Trail put this in themselves. They did the labor all themselves, and the town of Errol owns the property. It's right adjacent to a parking area, and I thought it was a great way to get people into the water. This is a snowmobile bridge in Lake Todd we just built a couple years ago. So part of what we use for deciding an RTP project, and this was a question in the Q&A, was how do we decide projects? What are the needs of the state? And this project was funded because the groomer, as well as snowmobiles and pedestrians, had to leave the trail, go up to the Route 103 bridge and cross over the bridge to get back onto the trail. So the groomer, we didn't want the groomer to be interfering with traffic. So a way to get them off of Route 103 and keep them on the trail was to build this bridge. So, and I know Tim Blagden's on the line right now, so I give him a little bit of kudos for helping spearhead this project with the Snowmobile Club. It was an excellent project. Keep going. So this was the repurposed historic bridge, one of my favorite projects. It was an old bridge that was rescued by the Harris Center for Conservation. The bridge abutments are 140 years old. So I went out here with the Division of Historic Resources. They approved this project because the character of the railroad, which was the historic abutments, was preserved with the historic bridge that was added on top of it. So every project gets reviewed by the Division of Historic Resources to not adversely affect the historic objects or properties that are within the project area. And in this case, it would be the abutments themselves as well as the rail corridor. So it was approved because of how they designed their project with the historic bridge and keeping that in mind to preserve the history of the railroad. So next slide, please. And new trail construction's Category D project, Seabrook was building a brand new rail trail to connect to part of the rail trail that actually goes into Massachusetts. So where Seabrook ended on the state line, it is picked up in Massachusetts, and it's continued on with another RTP project that will connect to their rail corridor over in Massachusetts. So, and I will turn this back over to Eric.
All right, so our next step is we're going to talk a little bit about how to apply. And before I hand it over to Bill to talk about LWCF, I've got one more poll for everybody. Give me 1 second here. And this is just to kind of get a gauge of who we have on the call today, as well as assist us in kind of who is eligible to vote or eligible to apply for which program. So we've got local government, conservation commissions, school districts, I meant to write OHRV, or snowmobile clubs, non-motorized trail clubs, nonprofits, general public, and some other. I'll give it another couple seconds here. All right. And thank you for those that shared. And with that said, I'm going to move on to pass it off to Bill. And Bill's going to kind of dive into the application process for the LWCF program. So Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. So the LWCF application process, it is roughly a 12 to 18 month process, and a lot of steps involved. And so I'll kind of go through this bullet list based on the current approximate timeline of what you could expect, per step, and currently how that timeline is falling within the calendar year. So typically in a grant year, and there was a point where we were holding grant years every 2 years. We're kind of back on track to hold them every year. It's all dependent on activity at the federal level, which directly steers how things can happen at the state level. But right now we're in a schedule that allows for sometime in March, April is typically when a grant round is released, and that opens up the intent period. And that's about a 1 month for potential sponsors to submit intent forms, which basically provides basic project and sponsor information. That is then reviewed by this office, the Office of Community Recreation, for general eligibility. And if it passes that test, then we'll move on to a period between approximately April through June for pre-application, pre-award inspection, site inspections. That's just further inspect sites for eligibility, making sure that all ground conditions, and as well as additional information that we might have extracted through conversation with potential sponsors to determine, again, if a sponsor and a project is eligible within the program. And then around July, those that are determined to be eligible will send out invitations to apply to sponsors for specific projects. And the application forms will also get sent out at that particular time for instructions. And also, selected applicants must also participate in an application workshop. The last one we had obviously was done online, which may be an easier way to do it moving forward. We'll have to reassess, a year from now. Hopefully things will be different, but it seemed to go work pretty well. And then that just gets you as a sponsor, potential sponsor, more familiar with the program, and hopefully to make your application more complete and efficient for review. And then come around August through October, that would be the open application period for sponsors that are invited to apply. And the way it's currently set up, applicants will submit 5 hard copies. We are moving towards a complete electronic and online system. The pandemic threw the department budget a bit out of whack, which interrupted that process and that intent. But it's still in our sites, and hopefully we're going to be moving towards an electronic application and grant management system. And then between October and December, after applications are received, will review the applications here at the office, and then set up our scoring and selections meetings with our advisory panel, and also with the state liaison officer, as Eric mentioned, is Commissioner Stewart, as well as the alternates, Eric and Director Bryce. And then roughly around January, notices of project selections are sent out to applicants. And remember, the first selection process, that's completely within the state. That's a state government process, what we call an open project selection process. It's actually a requirement within the LWCF program rules for all states to have one, in addition to the SCORP and having a designated state liaison officer. So those are the kind of the three pillars of eligibility for states to participate in the program. So within that open project selection process, we use an advisory panel, and that helps select projects. That's concurred on by the liaison officers. And then between January and March, we're coming back around a full year from when we started this. We will work with the applicants that have been selected, that are still choosing to move their projects forward, to then assemble the federal application packets. And most of that is identical to what we're having sponsors complete within the state application process. But there are a few differences, and then anything that might not be clear or additional information that's necessary, we'll work with local sponsors to make sure that that is collected and assembled into the federal application packet. And then the National Park Service operates currently, in their current system, operates 3 submission periods per year. And the way our schedule lines up is we try to get selections for state selections to be done prior to March. And, we want to get it done, as close to the beginning of the year as possible, so that local sponsors can take that to town meetings as necessary, so that if there needs to be a vote on for a matching requirement as part of any warrant article or any other type of local government vote, that there is that ability. It's not a final approval for the grant or for the project, but it does allow that to move forward for that assurance for match. And so the first, or well, actually, for National Park Service, this would actually be the second annual submission period, but the two that we target, the first one happens between April and March, which gives a grant project a start date in June of the same year. And then for those that we don't get in that submission period, the next submission period is between June and July, which gives a project a start date in September. And so that's where it puts it out to that 18-month start to finish application to grant initiation period. And then from there, grantees are given a 3-year period to complete a project. So that open grant period can be extended by up to an additional 2 years if absolutely necessary. But that first agreement is given only 3 years. And Eric mentioned before, 3 years prior to that, you can account for project planning and engineering costs that have been established in getting you to that point. So again, really important to accommodate for that into your budget. And then also just be aware that there are actually 2 grant agreements per grant, one between the federal government and the state, and then the state to the sub-sponsors for the local projects. And so we'll move on to the next one.
So Bill, we've got a question real quickly. Somebody asked, can you explain who is doing the scoring? Is this a public process to witness? I don't know if you want to just touch base real quickly on the OPSP AP and how that plays into this.
So it's technically not a public process. The panel is not set in statute. It's not set in rule. It's strictly advisory to the liaison officer, and by the LWCF rules actually gives a liaison officer complete autonomy on selection. We do this as a good faith effort to make sure that a variety of voices are heard. There are representatives from various other state agencies, including New Hampshire Fish and Game, DOT, Department of Education, Strategic Initiatives, Department of Environmental Services. We have the other user groups and conservation groups, Society of Protection National Forest, New Hampshire Forests. We have New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions, about 20 different representatives voicing different concerns. We've got representatives from local park and rec directors, city parks, town parks. We've got New Hampshire Recreation Park Association on there, as well as regional planning commissions. So we try to really diversify that as much as possible. And then, of course, that is all in advisement to the commissioner as the liaison officer, who can from there pick and choose what she determines would be the best use. And it's also important to remember that the apart from the commissioner having the ability to select projects, that we do a 60-40 split, which might have been touched on before, but 60% of the annual apportionments, as we work on a kind of a running basis, is that 60% will go to local projects and 40% will go to state projects. And we'll try to push the majority of the money out to local projects because that's where the most impact is. When we get into the next SCORP revision, we'll keep relooking at this process and what the best way to improve on that is. And so the application, as mentioned before, LWCF can only be submitted by a local government agency, and there must be a duly authorized official that is able to submit and enter into contracts. That might be through a certificate of vote, either selected by Board of Selectmen, or there might be some kind of authority established in town ordinance, city ordinance, whatnot. Again, right now we're still in a paper copy format, moving towards electronic. And if selected, all documents must then be available electronically, which helps us put together the federal application, which the feds have actually moved towards a federal electronic application system, which we're currently learning their new system. And so some project elements or application elements for a project, we would need things like location map, a boundary map which establishes the protection area per the Section 6F of the LWCF Act, certain federal standard forms for projects. They're known as the SF 424s, 424Cs, and 424D. We have got a specific project budget, proof of ownership, the inspection report for the pre-award application inspection. For acquisition combination projects, we also need parcel maps and concept design plans because, as Eric was mentioning before, there's got to be some at least idea and plan for access for an acquisition project. If it's an indoor facility or if it's a built facility such as a bathhouse or even a tennis court, the design and development plans, and if we were talking about the ski lodge at Abenaki in Wolfboro, we would need to see floor plans for such a facility. And then as applicable, there are other requirements that might be necessary to put into the federal application. We do an intergovernmental review through the Office of Strategic Initiatives. There would need to be relative NEPA documents if required, other federal law compliance documents, proof of flood insurance that comes into play if there are certain types of facilities within a determined flood zone. So as part of that application process, we look at federal flood insurance rate maps, and we have the Office of Strategic Initiatives review those. Any type of leases or memorandums of agreement, easements, so on and so forth, those will need to get reviewed for compliance within the program. If it's a school that is receiving funding for a playground, there's got to be a use schedule provided that shows when it might be closed to the public during school hours, but is open to the public thereafter. Something called the Dingell-Johnson certification. The Dingell-Johnson funds, that's a completely separate federal program which goes towards boat access facilities, and that is managed in New Hampshire through the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. And so LWCF does not allow for facilities that are eligible under Dingell-Johnson funds. So we have to coordinate with Fish and Game to make sure that any particular project submitted is not eligible under their program. They pretty much control all of those facilities under their management. So it's usually not an issue. And we've actually been seeing more boat access facility project come through LWCF, I think, that we have in previous years. There's a thing called waiver of retroactivity. Sometimes there might be critical, can't miss opportunities for projects to start. They're looked at and gone through with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that it's an absolute need. But sometimes a project can get started if it has a waiver of retroactivity approved by the National Park Service, but may not be necessarily, and that happens before the actual approval of the grant agreement allows for a local sponsor to start incurring costs, but it is not a guarantee of project approval. So there is a little bit of risk involved in there in pursuing one of those. But again, we got to be pretty stringent on when those are asked for and what type of projects, based on the type of need that is asked for. And then the acquisition donation acknowledgement, if there is any kind of bargain sale for an acquisition or any type of donation of property, that needs to be clearly understood and documented, just what that donation is. And so environmental reviews, permits, and project consultation. This is a real critical part to any project. So as required in the federal rules, the first thing you got to do is have a Section 106 review, which is a review through the State Historical Preservation Office at the Division of Historical Resources. And that is that should be done as soon as possible, because any flagging of a project for potential historic sensitivity could end a project right then and there. So the sooner you learn about the historical sensitivity of your project site, the better. And that could be included within your pre-planning and engineering costs if you end up needing to get an archaeological survey. And if a project site needs an archaeological survey, we would certainly want to see that prior to an application, because like I said, that type of need, depending on what is found, could really have a significant impact on how a particular project can proceed. There needs to be review by the Natural Heritage Bureau for the presence of threatened and endangered species, either plant or animal, and then any plan or recommendation on how to treat those, the presence of either moving forward. If there are any wetlands impacts, that's all got to be vetted through the DES Wetlands Bureau, whether that's going to require any type of permit, especially for boat launches, bridges, anything of the sort, raised boardwalks over wetlands areas. Got to be very clear on what type of permitting you're going to need for your project to move forward. And then certainly any other consultation that you'll need, reach out to Fish and Game if there's something relative to plants or animals. You can seek recommendations from the Public Water Access Advisory Board on where public water access is needed in the state. If it's something on a lake or river, you'll want to contact your local River Advisory Council or Lakes Council. There's a need for a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service review for particular types of animals regarding their migration and habitat behavior, as well as U.S. Army Corps of Engineers if it's a large enough scope wetland type impact. That's something that's usually done in conjunction with the DES Wetlands Bureau, but that's another potential consultation that a project may need. And then there's some points regarding accessibility. So any projects that can improve on accessibility, and we throw the word sustainable in there with accessibility because facilities that are built, specifically trails as well as other pathways and stuff, if they're built to be sustainable in a manner that is can stand up to heavy use as well as for erosion control, then they may very well or likely have the ability to be accessible as well. So there are two specific federal laws relative to accessibility. The Americans with Disabilities Act, got to remember that that is the land of the law. So any type of facility that you're building, if it falls within the ADA, you have no choice but to be compliant, LWCF assistance, RTP assistance, or not. Anything that falls within the ADA must be compliant. So within the ADA, and it's got this within Chapter 10 of the ADA is relative to recreation facilities specifically, but don't forget that earlier in the ADA and earlier chapters, can't remember which one specifically, but that's where you'll find requirements on bathrooms or food service facilities, so things like that. So you want to be familiar with the entire law. Get your code enforcement officer in your local town or city to be involved in this project to make sure that they are reviewing these requirements as well. But as you'll see here in Chapter 10, it covers amusement rides. So not everything in here is specific to public recreation, but it is how it's categorized in the ADA. So amusement rides, recreational boating areas, and there are certain details on that we can help kind of guide through. And then talks about exercise machines, fishing piers and platforms, golf facilities, mini golf facilities, play areas, swimming pools, wading pools and spas, and shooting facilities. So a few of those things are eligible under our LWCF. A few of them obviously are not. So we can work with you through that process. Now, keep in mind, under the ADA, there are no current or pending accessibility guidelines or standards for campgrounds, picnic areas, or trails. So there are best management practices, which we'll get into in the next slide. And that's where the Architectural Barriers Act, the ABA, comes in. And so the ABA is specific to federal buildings and facilities. It has since been amended to include federal programs. However, timing is everything. And when the current LWCF manual and rules were established, predated the amendment to the ABA, which required, or which would have required LWCF to be included in that. LWCF is up for a manual revision, so you can pretty much be assured that the ABA will be included in the next version. So everything within the ABA at this point for LWCF, it's not technically a requirement, but it is a best management practice and would be viewed positively in any type of proposal that included some of these considerations. So within the ABA, you'll find information about campgrounds and picnic areas, viewing areas, routes in between these types of facilities, beach access routes, and trails. That's not to say, again, that all trails must be accessible. There are certain types of trail assessment guidelines talking about pitch and location that would necessitate when trails would need to be required to fall within certain accessibility rules, but not all trails are meeting that standard. The U.S. Forest Service put out a few guidelines on how to implement ABA and as well as Chapter 10 of the certain elements of Chapter 10 of the ADA. And so those are known as the Forest Service Outdoor Recreation Accessibility Guidelines and the Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines. Those are available online through the USDA website, as well as there's certain other links that can be found through, I believe the RTP provides some links through the federal RTP website, but these can be found on site. We have some hard copies as well that we'll typically give out. I don't know if we're going to be able to get any more of those now that, but we have given out hard copies of those previously. And so from there, I think that's it for that slide. And we'll go on to the next slide. So post-completion and stewardship. What we do through this office, there are really three main elements to the LWCF program that are managed. One is distribution of funds in the whole selection process, reviewing applications, and setting up the application process as a whole. And then two, once those are selected, getting into the open project management, which is, I think right now we've got at any time 20 to 30 different projects going on at any given time. And then once a project is closed out, enters into the perpetual stewardship requirement. We talked about how that is a provision within the LWCF Act. And so what we'll do from there is, as we close out a grant and we complete the final reimbursements and final inspections to make sure the project is complete, we finalize what we call the 6F map, and that's per the Section 6F of the original LWCF Act, which outlines what the project is specifically that is subject to this federal stewardship requirement under the rules. We also require a notice of grant requirement if it's not already built into the property deed, but a notice of grant requirement to be filed with the Registry of Deeds so that during any deed research, because this is a perpetual program, 50 years from now, if nobody in town remembers anything about this specific project, at least that's a filter that allows any deed research that happening that raises the red flag that there are federal requirements attached to the program. We are required to do a 5-year inspection cycle to make sure that properties are still being used for their original intent and purpose. However, unfortunately, we're experiencing such a backlog. As you can imagine, the program never shrinks, it only increases as a perpetual stewardship program. So we try to keep up on a 5-year inspection cycle, but sometimes we lag a little bit behind, but we try to keep up on that as best as we can. And then as the grant agreement, which includes what used to be a separate document, now they're all included into one. As a project sponsor, a local municipality or government entity will sign on to assurances that the property will be maintained in perpetuity. And with that, we reference back to what's currently Chapter 8 in the LWCF State and Local Assistance Program Manual, which outlines the requirements for perpetual stewardship. And the biggest issue where non-stewardship happens is what we call a conversion. And if a conversion happens, or if it's determined that a 6F encumbered site is not being used as intended, or is not available to the public per program rules, then it is up to the sponsor to find substitute property, adequate substitute property that must be approved by the Department of Interior for encumbrance into 6F protection. So that's a pretty arduous process, one that doesn't preclude changes in sites, but is designed to discourage it. So with that in mind, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Bill. So to launch into RTP on how to apply, one of the things I always tell everybody is there will be 3 workshops held in May. I do these every year, and they are very specific to the RTP program, and it goes into detail on how to apply, what to include, what to expect with the billing and reimbursement process and the closeout. So anybody who is interested in applying to RTP, it is required to attend at least one of those. This workshop today that we are hosting right now does not satisfy that requirement. There will be a virtual option. I think I'm going to hybrid 2 of the first daytime and the first nighttime workshop, and then one of the workshops will probably be just in person. So I suggest to anybody who's thinking about applying now to download the RTP guidelines, which are on the RTP website, and start thinking about the project as a whole. Like, what are you looking to achieve? What is your goal for the project? And work from there to decide how this project can be completed, what materials and equipment you would need. And then you would definitely need to secure any private landowner permission with your application. Next slide. So you will be identified by the primary and permitted users for the trail for both summer and winter use. So we divide all RTP projects into motorized, non-motorized, and diversified use. So what that means is motorized means you allow either ATVs or snowmobiles or trail bikes, essentially something with a motor. Non-motorized means no motorized allowances at all. So it's just pedestrian use or equestrian or sled dogs or skiing or bicycling or mountain biking. And then diversified is a mix of those 2, most commonly on our rail trails, with pedestrian use in the summer and snowmobile use in the winter. That's the most common. These applications are scored against others within that user category. So if you're a non-motorized project, you will be scored against other non-motorized projects. Next slide. So some numbers, some state and local assistance for New Hampshire. All eligible projects are selected by the RTP selection committee. Common question is, who's on this committee? It varies from year to year as determined by the Trails Bureau chief. So it's based on availability of state employees that we have that represent different trail groups. Okay. For over the past, since 1996, we've had over 857 state and local projects funded with more than 16 million in grant assistance. That's all I can find back to 1996, even though the program started in 1991. And current, our allocation model is 70% of the total project allowance to local projects, so communities, nonprofit organizations, and then 30% is held for state projects. So that's for us to do repairs using our state employees on our state properties. And then those 70% and 30% are then divided 30 motorized, 30 non-motorized, and 40 for diversified. So these actual percentages vary from year to year based on the quality of quantity of projects, but we try to stick as close as possible to that divide. Next slide, please. So just like with LWCF, we have to have environmental, wetlands, and historical reviews. Just like what Bill said, RTP is subject to the Natural Heritage Bureau review for rare plants and animal species. You basically get a PDF form and it comes back to you with a list of any species that are within your project area that could be impacted by your project. If that happens, you have to contact Fish and Game for animals or Heritage Review for plants and exemplary communities. So, and all projects also have to be familiar with the 2017 Best Management Practice for Erosion Control that was published by the Trails Bureau. So this manual is on our website, and we basically point everybody in the direction. If you're going to do trail maintenance, this is what we're looking for you to know first. So as you're describing your project methods, we're going to be looking for techniques that are specified in the BMP manual that the Trail Bureau produced. Next slide, please. So with the wetlands reviews, it's a project sponsor's responsibility to obtain any necessarily wetlands permits. Sorry. DES reviewed and renewed these wetlands rules back in 2019, and they have had amendments since then. But if you are unsure if your project needs a permit, you need to contact Wetlands Bureau and ask. They can help you determine which type of permit you may need. But the rules do specify specific lengths of shoreline if you're impacting, the square footage of your project area. So it's very specific to your project. So next slide, please. Historical reviews, same thing. We have to review every project with our Division of Historic Resource Office. They have their own tool that they use called EMIT, very similar to the Natural Heritage Bureau. I help the RTP potential grantees with this process. I do all of this through EMIT, and I review them with the Division of Historic Resources. Grantees may have to perform additional Phase 1A or Phase 1B surveys if DHR determines there may be impacts. And that is not reimbursable by RTP because it has to be completed before a contract is issued, which means you would be outside the allowed time for match or reimbursement. So in the application, specifically ask if you are digging, what kind of square footage, if you're near a cemetery or anything that could send up red flags with historic resources. Next slide, please. So funding match and timelines, I will turn it back over to Eric and Bill.
All right, thank you, Alexis. So flow of funds for LWCF. So again, LWCF requires a minimum 50-50 match requirement. So you cannot request a grant greater than 50% of your total project. And currently, grant amounts for LWCF are available between $25,000 and $400,000. So for a total project cost range, the minimum total project cost would have to be $50,000 for consideration. Then, of course, on the higher end, $800,000 or above, because you can never not overmatch. So again, $25,000 to $400,000 for direct grant. And the flow of funds, as you'll see on this chart, and unfortunately the unit is actually supposed to go with the United States Department of the Interior. But as local government sponsors incur costs, can request reimbursements on a rolling basis within the project period. or can save them towards the end of the closeout period. So requests come in to the state, to this office. This office reviews the expenses and documentation for eligibility. We'll then draw down the funds from the federal accounts to the state accounts and then reimburse the local sponsors from the state accounts. And I'll pass that off to Alexis.
Thank you. So RTP is a little bit different. So local sponsors incur cost, and then the state of New Hampshire through DNCR will reimburse the local sponsor. Then I take all of the projects together, and then I request reimbursement from the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation then sends that off to Federal Highway Administration for approval, and then it trickles back down to the state of New Hampshire. So we incur costs based from the local sponsors on your behalf. So that's why some of the paperwork for RTP, when I request the backup documentation, I'm very strict because we are basically incurring that cost on your behalf. And if it is denied by the Federal Highway Administration, we may have to come back to the local sponsor to request reimbursement back to the state of New Hampshire. My job is to make sure that doesn't happen, which is why we make sure our backup documentation is very precise. Next slide, please. So reimbursement base, which is what I said. So the project sponsor, you do your project, and then you submit to me any invoices and receipts and whatnot, and then I reimburse you based on whether or not that documentation is complete. So you can apply from $8,000 to $80,000 for construction projects. Minimum total project cost is $10,000 with an $8,000 request and $2,000 in match. RTP is an 80 to 20% match. LWCF is 50-50. So you get a lot more money from the RTP program for your total project. What's great about the match is you can use soft match like volunteer labor. So if you have enough volunteers, you can essentially not incur any costs from your organization because 80% would be from RTP, and you can have 20% basically be all of your volunteer labor or donations. So it's up to you and how you want to manage your project. Only 2 applications are allowed per organization per grant year, and the total amount of requests from that application can exceed $80,000. All of this I go into in more depth in my RTP workshop, so I suggest you attend. Next slide, please. Match can only occur after GNC approval. This is a big thing because back before I started, match could start if you were approved for a project from our agency, from DNCR, you could start incurring match immediately. And then that match can be going toward your project, even though you don't even have a contract yet and you don't have GNC. So DOT and Fed Highway told us that we're no longer allowed to do that. So you have to wait until I issue the notice to proceed, which I will do after the governor and council has approved all of the grant contracts. This usually happens in late spring to early summer. Last year with the virus, it kind of pushed us back quite a bit. So we didn't start till July of last year when projects could start incurring cost and match. But I'm working very hard to get that a little bit earlier in the year like it was previously. Volunteer labor is at an hourly rate, depending on what that person's doing. That volunteer, if they are a skilled laborer, like a welder or something along those lines, or a carpenter, they have to provide that adequate backup documentation. So I also get into that at our RTP workshop, but it's very spelled out when you are requesting skilled labor. I have to have such as timesheets and whatnot. So, okay, next slide, please. So who's got the match? This is something I'll start first with RTP and I'll let Eric get into it for the LWCF. For the RTP, you can match with cash. If you want to have an in-kind donation from an organization, donations such as a cash match or any other types of donations. For RTP, you have to have an invoice showing the value of an in-kind donation. So say if you are having a company donate lumber, that company needs to produce something to show the value of that lumber that will be used towards your 20% of grant match. And volunteer time, which is excellent. The more volunteers you have that put towards labor towards that project, So the more money we can put into the project itself. For federal grants, RTP can be matched with other federal grants, but not for many from the Highway Trust Fund. So for example, the Federal Land Access Program, the FLAP grant, cannot be used to match the RTP grant because the money comes from the same Highway Trust Fund. LWCF can be matched with RTP. I will let Eric get into that. And then state funds for RTP, such as the grant and aid, is only open to snowmobile and OHRV clubs, but they can use the grant and aid funds to match the RTP program. If you were applying for that, you would have to apply for RTP first and then apply for the spring round of the next year for a grant and aid. So that way the timelines match up. So, Eric, I will turn this over to you.
I'm actually going to turn it over to Bill, and Bill's going to dive into the match requirements for LWCF.
All right, thank you. So the basic premise for match for RTP, or excuse me, for LWCF is that if for it to be eligible for match, it has to be eligible for funding. The only exception is volunteer labor. So volunteer labor, just like for RTP, volunteer labor is eligible to be accounted for match. Everything else really must be within the eligible categories for funding. So cash, if that cash is local municipal cash, if it's coming in from a third party source, whether it's another local grant or state grant or another federal grant, depending on what it is, that's all considered cash. In kind, that match, or as again, can also be reimbursable. In kind labor, own force labor, own force or own equipment that a municipality may have. We've got specific equipment rates that are based off FEMA and their current rates, but salary can be reimbursed. So if own force labor is working on a specific project and you're able to track those hours, those are actually reimbursable to a municipality or can be used as match. Donation, just like Alexis was talking about, there must be documentation as far as what that donation is. That can be in services or material. If it's services, there needs to be appropriate documentation provided by in an invoice form from the service provider. And then we're talking about federal grants, as Alexis mentioned, LWCF and RTP can match each other. For LWCF, RTP is one of the very few other federal programs that can be used against LWCF for match, as well as community development block grants. So if you're thinking, it defaults to the more stringent match requirement. So whereas RTP maximum for funding is $80,000, you couldn't match more than $80,000 against LWCF. So you could, in theory, have a $160,000 total cost project completely funded by the federal government in a reimbursement form, with $80,000 coming from LWCF and $80,000 coming from RTP. Timing is the hard part, but it is feasible. And then any costs thereafter, you can increase that amount on the LWCF side because the ceiling for funding is higher. However, that would increase the need for other types of match resources to be applied to that. And so we'll move on. I'll pass that back off to Eric, talk about timeline.
So I just want to make one comment to add to Bill's last statement about timing is everything. Alexis and RTP and LWCF, we've been working really hard to try to match our timelines up as best as we can so that communities or groups can come forth that are eligible for both of these programs and develop a project that would be eligible. I'll say this is, if you are thinking of that, before you get to that point of putting together an application or an intent, let's have that conversation. We'll share our contact information, but it's good to start that conversation early so that we can build your project around the current timelines that we allow. Alexis has a little bit of a tighter ability to spend her funds in a quicker period of time than LWCF does. And so timing really has to be really scheduled out to make sure it works. So with that said, we'll talk quickly about timelines. The timeline that I'm going to share was kind of what we ran for our last grant round. Things may change in the future, but at least just to get an idea of, for everybody out there, of what the process takes. We launched our last grant round our intent started last April. So there's actually another check mark that's unfortunately not here. That's as a start, which is the intent process, which for us is that 1-page documentation that we look for, which gives us a basic project description and a basic needs statement, as well as your dollar request. That last year came out April or May. And then through our workshop and letter of intent to apply, final applications were due at the end of October. From there, we then moved to our review and selection with scoring and review of our open project selection process advisory panel and our state liaison officer taking place in December, November, with a final score being scored and released in January. And as Bill stated, we have certain windows that we have to apply through the feds and the 2 submission periods that we try to time out, as well, not only assist with local communities if they need to go to public meeting to vote for a warrant article. Our first submission period is usually April to May, with a project start in June. And then the second window is a June to July application period with a start date of September. I will say, from start to finish and just the application process, so this is from intent to final National Park Service approval, you're talking anywhere between a year to a year and a half. So it's really important when you're thinking about putting your project together, that projects are ready to go, so that as soon as that year comes up and National Park Service approves your project, you can begin. I will now pass it off to the RTP world.
Thank you, Eric. So for RTP, it is basically a year out from when you apply to about when you are ready to start your project. And that is when I give the notice to proceed. So this is the current timeline for the next application period, which will start this April. It's open for 12 weeks. So it starts April and then it ends mid-June. And that is actually the current application deadline will be Friday, June 18th of 2021 for Project Z for federal fiscal year 2022. So after that happens, after I get all the applications in, there's a state review period through the summer and fall. This is when we score the projects. I bring the projects to any state reviews I need to do. And then we go through the federal review process, which is what I'm doing right now for federal fiscal year 2021 Project Y. So right now I'm working through the NEPA process for the RTP project as a whole. Once that is complete, the project is active late spring, early summer of 2022. That is when you'll be able to start your project. That's when the shovel ready comes into play, and you'll have to about 6 to 8 months to complete your project. And then the project closes. The current contracts end December 31st of every year. So it's the last day of the calendar year. And then that next, you have 30 days to submit all your final paperwork. And then I close up the project, which is also what I'm doing for the previous year right now, for the previous application, for the previous project year. So part of our timeline right there. With the LWCF, to match that, you would have to apply to LWCF first to get the project lined up with RTP. And that is why Eric said timing is everything with these. For GIA, it's a little bit easier. I've worked with the GIA coordinator enough to, we've gotten it down where you apply to RTP first. And so you would apply to RTP now for your project for next summer's construction. but you would apply to grant and aid in the spring of 2022. So, and that's all. So turn it back over to Eric.
All right. So with that said, that kind of ends our information session of the three of us spewing information about these two great programs. And so I wanted to leave some time for any questions that folks may have. But before we get to those questions, I have one last poll. And now that you guys have heard a little bit about the funding source, hopefully some projects are crossing your mind. But we'd like to know kind of what's holding you back from moving forward. And so I'm going to put this out there, and we're looking to see if it's funding, if project design, if project management, if permitting is an issue, grant writing, legal control, or permission, community support, or other. As we work to manage these two grant programs, one of the areas that we're starting to look into is how can we provide further assistance beyond just as a funding source to help groups that are eligible for these grant programs to get the money down onto the ground. So this will kind of help us shape that future. So I appreciate everybody if you're able to respond to that. And with that said, I will share our last slide. Some folks asked about contact information. Again, our website is the best place to visit. It's usually where we will update our grant round information. For LWCF, we do have a generic LWCF email box that both Bill and I have access to. We always recommend that's a great place to start. You can always call us. Obviously, with the current pandemic and some staff working from home, the easiest way is that email, but you can definitely get in touch via phone as well. And then Alexis's information is off to the right. I will say that there is hope that not only will RTP open in the very near future, sometime in the next month or two, but hopefully LWCF will follow an open grant round in the very near future as well, hopefully in the next month or so. And our website is the best place to visit. All right. So I will open it up to if folks have questions. And we've got a question. Is it hard to develop a state property into a state park? I'm not quite sure what you mean, Jason. Bill,
It looks, yeah, it looks like this is the reference to the state school. Or okay, this is talking about land in Manchester. Yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of out of our wheelhouse for this specific workshop. That would be something that would have to be kind of at the director and commissioners level, as well as the state parks planning office. Certainly a process, but would have to be reviewed on a number of levels within the division and department, showing need and ability to take on a specific type. So certainly a lot of questions, a lot of factors that would go into it. So difficult, yeah, I would say probably fairly difficult.
All right. Another person asked if we have time constraints and need to improve a trailhead, are there other resources we should consider? So let's see. Allison, are you asking time constraints? Are you asking about other resources just as funding? Can you elaborate a little bit more on, is your trailhead, is it a public trailhead, private trailhead?
And then a follow-up question for Jason, asking where do I start? Are you asking about where do you start for the application process? And then again, be specific whether you're asking about LWCF or RTP.
We're kind of jumping around on questions, but somebody asked during a acquisition project, how is it funded, being that it's a reimbursement basis? And you're correct, full funds need to be on hand at time of closing. Again, both programs are reimbursement basis, so costs need to be incurred at 100% prior to being reimbursed.
All right, getting back to Jason's question, would the discussion start with the city or with the state? So it always starts at the local sponsor level. So if you are not necessarily a city or a municipality employee, or if you're not attending this in representation of a municipality, but you have a great idea for a municipal project, then certainly approach your local officials, whichever office you choose. There's a number of offices that you could go through, either the planning office or recreation office or the conservation commission. But if you have an idea, find an advocate, someone within the local government that can buy into the project, and then start planning it from there. And that would be the starting point. And then once you can get buy-in or interest from the municipality, we're always available for consultation thereafter, and can kind of move that forward.
So just with regards to the previous question from Allison regarding time constraints on a trailhead, the fact that it's a town forest and you're running into parking challenges with increased utilization, I'm guessing that that increased utilization is due to the increase in outdoor recreation usage statewide, or if not nationally wide, due to the current pandemic. And I would say to this is, one is start with the town. If the town is able to fund increased development on their own or with some private assistance or volunteer assistance, but for funding, at least through this agency, these are those two funding sources that would do just that. As Bill talked about, there is some ability for a faster period, or what we call a waiver of retroactivity, but you'd have to have your project really far along in the development to receive that during our scoring round. And what I would say is, if that is something you might be interested in, please reach out to us at the LWCF program, and we can help you through that process.
There's a question in the chat box, asks, can LWCF funds be applied for land that is fee owned by a nonprofit organization, but a government entity holds a conservation easement on the same property? It would all be dependent on what the terms of the conservation easement are, whether it provides that adequate legal control for the municipality to put perpetually steward or money that requires perpetual stewardship. So very specific question on what is allowable within that easement. Is it is feasible. It's preferable that a local sponsor own the property in fee, but it is possible.
And we're starting to see a lot more projects, at least on the LWCF side, come to fruition in examples like that. And as Bill said, that the key is making sure that the project sponsor understands the perpetuity of the project, and that they have an ability to maintain perpetual control of that property. And if for some reason that easement is removed or something happens with the property, ultimate compliance would have to fall to the project sponsor. So they would have to be ready if something like that happened to find substitute property under the LWCF program. So with that said, I'll give it another minute if other folks might have some questions. We've got about another minute left. Otherwise, I just want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And as I said, hopefully this will be one of many opportunities for our agency to share the two grant programs we manage with the general public. I want to thank Alexis and Bill for joining me tonight. Like I said at the beginning, this webinar was recorded. We plan to host it on our website in the coming week or so. I will do my best to send out a message to everybody that has registered with that link. And again, I appreciate everybody for joining us tonight, and have a good night.
And get outside. Have fun.
Oh, good night, everybody.